Yet, unexpectedly, it hadn't yet reached the morning hours when a noisy commotion outside pulled him out of his meditative state. A clamor of footsteps mixed with wailing and screaming was rapidly approaching, and Wei Wuxian heard these cries repeated. "Break in and drag him out! Report him to the authorities! Who cares about the authorities? Just beat him to death!" He opened his eyes just as a number of servants charged in. The entire courtyard was lit up as bright as day, and someone was shouting, "Drag that murdering lunatic to the main hall and make him pay with his life!" Wei Wuxian's first thought was, did something go wrong with those youths' flag formation? The smallest carelessness in the usage of his inventions could cause disaster, which was why he had earlier purposely gone to verify whether the spirit attraction flag was properly drawn. Thus, when those large hands came to drag him out the door, Wei Wuxian lay there limply, allowing himself to be dragged out. It saved him the trouble anyway. He was dragged to the East Hall, where it was just as lively as could be. Surprisingly, there were no fewer townspeople gathered there than there had been during the day. Many of the servants and close family relations had come, some still dressed in their inner robes, not having had time to coif their hair, panic painted on each of their faces. Lady Mo sat slumped in her seat as if she had only just awoken from having fainted. There were traces of tears on the sides of her cheeks, and the rims of her eyes were still wet. However, the moment Wei Wuxian was dragged in, her tears instantly transformed into a baleful glare. On the ground there lay something that resembled the form of a human. The body was covered by a white sheet, and only its head was exposed. Lan Sijie and those youths were bent down over it, inspecting the body solemnly and whispering to each other. Their words filtered into Wei Wuxian's ears. "It hasn't been one incense time since he was discovered. Right after subduing the walking corpses, we were rushing to the east courtyard, and the dead body was lying there in the corridor." This body was Mo Ziyuan. Wei Wuxian swept a glance over him, and then took another look in spite of himself. The corpse looked like Mo Ziyuan, but at the same time not. While the facial features were clearly those of his cheap little cousin, the cheeks were deeply sunken, the eyeballs bulging, and the skin wrinkled. It was as if he had aged 20 years compared to the previous Mo Ziyuan, who had been in the prime of his youth. It almost seemed as if he had been sucked dry of his blood and flesh. He looked like a mere sack of bones, dressed in an extremely thin veil of skin. If it could have been said that the Mo Ziyuan of before was simply ugly, then his corpse now was both old and ugly. Wei Wuxian was just taking a detailed look when Madame Mo suddenly came charging over. Something shining flashed in her hand. She was holding a dagger. Moving as fast as his eyes saw, Lan Sijie knocked the knife out of her hand, but before he could say anything, Madame Mo was already screaming at him. "My son died a tragic death. I need to avenge him. What are you stopping me for?" Wei Wuxian once again ducked behind Lan Sijie and shot back, "What does your son's tragic death have to do with me?" Lan Sijie watched Wei Wuxian make a scene during the day, and then later heard plenty of exaggerated rumors about this illegitimate son from the others. He felt great pity for this mentally ill person and couldn't help but try and speak up for the man. "Madame Mo, the state of your son's corpse is clearly the work of evil. Its blood, flesh, and spirit have been completely sucked out. He could not have been the culprit." Madame Mo's chest heaved. "What do you know? This lunatic's father is a cultivator, so he must have learned plenty of evil magic." Lan Sijie looked back and took a glance at the seemingly half-witted Wei Wuxian. "Madam, there is no evidence, so it is still best." "The evidence is my son's body!" Madame Mo pointed at the corpse on the ground. "Take a look yourself. Ayuan's dead body has already told me who his murderer is." Without waiting for the others to make a move, Wei Wuxian raced to pull back the sheet from head to toe. Mo Ziyuan's corpse had something missing. His left arm, from the shoulder down, had vanished as if it had sprouted wings. Madame Mo added, "You see that? You all heard him today, right? What this lunatic said. That if Ayuan touched his things again, he would chop off his arm." After her hysterics had settled, she covered her face and sobbed. My poor Ayuan never touched anything of this lunatic's. Not only was he slandered, he was killed by this maniac. Maniac? It was so endearing. How many years had it been since he'd heard himself described as such? Wei Wuxian pointed at himself, but he didn't have the words to rebuke that particular statement. He didn't know either whether he was really mental or if Madame Mo was the one who was ill. After all, he had boasted about slaughtering entire sects, laying waste to millions, making blood flow like rivers, and other such things when he was younger, but that was all talk most of the time. If he really could do all of that, he would have tyrannized the world already. Madame Mo wasn't trying to avenge her son at all. She was only looking for someone to vent her anger on. Wei Wuxian didn't want to bother with her. After a moment of thought, he reached into Mo Ziyuan's robes and searched, finally digging something out. When he unfolded that something, it was a spirit attraction flag. In that instant, it dawned on him. He muttered under his breath, Mo Ziyuan brought this on himself. When Lan Sijie and the others saw the item taken out of Mo Ziyuan's robes, they also understood what had happened. Thinking back to the farce that had taken place during the day, it wasn't hard to deduce what had transpired. Earlier, Mo Ziyuan had lost considerable face due to Mo Xuanyu's hysterics, filling him up with hatred. He'd had a mind to settle scores, but Mo Xuanyu had gone out frolicking and was nowhere to be found, so Mo Ziyuan intended to wait until nighttime to teach Mo Xuanyu an underhanded lesson. And yet, when night came and he snuck out the door, as he passed by the west courtyard, he saw the spirit attraction flags planted atop the wall eaves. While there were strict instructions against outings at night, and that the west courtyard was forbidden, and that those black flags were not to be touched under any circumstances, Mo Ziyuan thought that was the cultivators purposely scaring people off because they were afraid of others stealing their precious spiritual weapons. He was unaware of just how dangerous and ominous the effects of the spirit attraction flag were, and that once held, a flag would make the bearer a living target. Mo Ziyuan's hands had never been clean. He'd grown addicted to stealing the talismans and spiritual tools belonging to his crazy older cousin. So when he saw the magical objects, he couldn't help but feel the itch to take them for himself, no matter the cost. Thus, while the owners of the flags were subduing walking corpses in the west courtyard, he secretly plucked one away. The flag formation utilized 6 spirit attraction flags, 5 of which were set up in the west courtyard using those used from the Lan family as bait. However, they themselves were protected by the countless spiritual tools carried on their persons. Although Mo Ziyuan had only stolen the one flag, he didn't have any proper protective tools on him. Go after the weakest, as they say. Naturally, the evil spirits were lured to him. If it had been only walking corpses, then it wouldn't have been a big deal. At most, he'd have been bitten a couple of times, and it wouldn't have resulted in his death. There would still have been a chance to save him. And yet, it just so happened that this spirit attraction flag had unintentionally summoned something much more terrifying than walking corpses, and it was precisely this evil, unknown spirit that had killed Mo Ziyuan and robbed him of his arm. Wei Wuxian raised his wrist. Sure enough, a cut on his left arm was healed. It seemed the sacrificial ritual had acknowledged Mo Ziyuan's death as his doing. After all, the spirit attraction flag was Wei Wuxian's invention, so he'd hit the mark out of pure luck. Madame Mo was perfectly aware of her son's little flaws, but she would never admit that Mo Ziyuan had caused his own death. Anxious and aggravated, she picked up a teacup and hurled it at Wei Wuxian's face. If you hadn't made a scene and framed him in front of so many people yesterday, would he have gone out in the middle of the night? It's all your fault, you bastard! Wei Wuxian was already prepared and sidestepped to dodge the attack. Madame Mo then screamed at Lan Sijie, "And you bunch of useless fools! What cultivators are you? What evil can you exercise? You can't even protect a child! Ayuan is so young!" Those youths were still green, and only had so much experience under their belts. They hadn't detected anything unusual in this area, which was why they'd never thought that there would be such a ferocious evil. At first, they'd been quite sorry because they felt themselves lacking, but after Madame Mo's indiscriminate tongue-lashing, they were growing upset. After all, they came from a distinguished clan. No one had ever dared to treat them in this way. The teachings of the Lan clan of Gusu were extremely strict. They forbade raising a hand against normal folk, and not even rudeness was allowed. Even though they were irritated, they had to force it down, causing dark expressions to cloud their faces. Wei Wuxian couldn't take it anymore. He thought, after so many years, the Lan family still acts this way. What's the use of all that self-restraint unless you're looking to suffocate yourselves? Watch me. He spat loudly. Who do you think you're yelling at? Do you really take them to be your servants? They came all this way to exercise evil for free, and now they owe you? How old is your son again? He's at least 17, right? A child still? How old do you have to be to understand human language? Did they not instruct us again and again yesterday not to go near the west courtyard and not to touch anything in the formation? Your son snuck out in the middle of the night to dally about. Is that my fault? Or is it his fault? Lan Jingyi and the others let out a breath, no longer looking as upset. Madame Mo was both extremely sad and resentful, and her mind was filled with nothing but thoughts of death. More specifically, it wasn't thoughts of herself dying to accompany her son, but rather thoughts of having everybody else in this world die, and especially the ones currently in front of her. Whenever something happened, she'd always order her husband around, so she shoved him. Call everyone in! Call everyone in here! However, her husband was in a daze. Perhaps the shock of the death of his only son was too great, but he shoved her back. Knocked down to the ground so abruptly, Madame Mo was stunned. If this had been before, Madame Mo needn't have pushed him. As long as she raised her voice a tiny bit, he'd do whatever she said. And yet today he dared fight back. The servants were all terrified by her expression, and a trembling Ading helped her to stand. Madame Mo grabbed her heart and said with a shaking voice, You get lost too. Her husband seemed not to have heard. Ading shot Atong a number of looks, and Atong quickly dragged his master out. It was chaos within the East Hall. Seeing how the family was finally quieting down, Wei Wuxian went to inspect the corpse further. However, he had barely glanced at it before another high-pitched scream pierced through the door. The crowd inside the hall poured out and were greeted with the sight of two bodies spasming on the ground in the east courtyard. One was a slumped Atong, alive. The other was collapsed on the ground, its body wrinkled and withered as if its blood and flesh had been completely sucked dry. Its left arm was already gone, and there was no blood flowing from the wound. The state of this corpse was exactly the same as Mo Ziyuan's. Madame Mo had just shaken off Ading's supporting hand, but when she saw that corpse lying on the ground, she was stunned in place. At last exhausted of the energy to throw more fits, she fainted. Wei Wuxian happened to be standing near her, so he caught her and passed her to Ading as she came running over. He then took a glance at his right hand. A cut there was gone as well. Madame Mo's husband had only stepped onto the threshold of the hall. He hadn't even entered the yard before he died tragically right on the spot. Everything had happened within an instant. Lan Sijie, Lan Jingyi, and the others all paled, but Lan Sijie was the first to compose himself. He questioned a slumped Atong. Did you see what it was? Atong was thoroughly horrified, his teeth clenched so hard that he couldn't utter a word for the moment, only shaking his head. Lan Sijie, burning with impatience, instructed his peers to bring the boy inside before turning to Lan Jingyi. Did you fire the signal? I did, Lan Jingyi replied. But if there are no seniors nearby who can come to offer assistance, our people will probably take at least an hour before they can make it here. What do? We don't even know what it is right now. It was, of course, impossible for them to leave. If a clan's disciples only cared about escape when running into evil spirits, then not only would they embarrass the clan, but they themselves would be too ashamed to go out again. The terrified folks of the Mo household could not leave with them either. The evil spirit was most likely among them, so it would have been useless even if they fled. Lan Sijie clenched his teeth. Stay on guard until help arrives. Since the distress signal was already fired, other cultivators would soon come to their aid. In order to avoid adding to the present trouble, by all accounts Wei Wuxian should have retreated. Best if whoever came was no one he knew. If it was someone he had crossed paths with before, or had fought with, then it was hard to tell what would happen. With the sacrificial ritual's curse still on him, he could not leave the Mo estate. Besides, if the summoned creature could take 2 lives within such a short span of time, then it was abnormally ferocious. If Wei Wuxian dropped everything and left, then by the time reinforcements arrived, the entire Mo estate would have its streets filled with missing corpses missing their left arms. And surely, some of those corpses would include the familial disciples of the Lan clan of Gusu. After a moment's deliberation, Wei Wuxian said to himself, "Let's end this quickly." Those youths were fledglings, each of them looking nervous. Despite that, they still scrupulously took their places to protect the Mo Manor and stuck talismans inside and outside of the hall. The servant Atong had already been carried inside, and Lan Sijie checked his pulse with his left hand while his right massaged Madame Mo's back. He couldn't treat both at once and was in a sorry dilemma when suddenly Atong crawled up from the ground. Ading exclaimed, "Atong, you're awake!" Before any delight could cross her face, Atong raised his left hand and seized his own neck. Seeing this, Lan Sijie targeted several of Atong's acupoints with a triple tap of his hand apiece. Wei Wuxian knew that while the Lan clan appeared gentle on the surface, their arm strength was not gentle in the least. Using that method, anyone could be rendered thoroughly unable to move. However, Atong appeared not to have felt a thing. His left hand gripped harder and harder, his face scrunching more and more with the pain. Lan Jingyi went over to pull at his left hand, but it was like trying to break off a chunk of iron, immovable. Moments later, crack! Atong's head drooped down, and only then did the hand let go. But his neck was already broken. He had actually strangled himself before the eyes of all. Seeing this, Ading's voice trembled. "A ghost! There's an invisible ghost here, and it made Atong strangle himself!" Her voice was shrill and sad, raising the hairs on everyone's necks. They all believed her. Wei Wuxian determined it to be the exact opposite, however. This wasn't a malicious ghost. He had seen the talismans those youths had chosen, and they were the spirit-repelling type. They had plastered the entire East Hall with them, airtight. If this really were a malicious spirit, then those talismans would have immediately burned with green flames when they entered the hall. Things would not be as quiet as they were now. It wasn't that this group of youths was slow to react. It was that the intruder was truly ferocious in nature. The cultivation sects had strict criteria for determining whether something was a malicious ghost. One was considered such if it killed once a month for up to 3 months consecutively. This was a criterion Wei Wuxian himself had set, and it was probably still in use now. Dealing with this type was his specialty, and based on what he'd seen, killing once every 7 days would make this creature a malicious ghost that caused particularly frequent mischief. However, this thing had just killed 3 times in a row, and in a short span of time, too. Even accomplished cultivators would have been hard-pressed to come up with a counter-strategy, never mind these novice juniors. Just as he was thinking this, the firelight flashed. A blast of sinister wind whipped by, and every lantern and every candle in the entire courtyard, including the East Hall, was extinguished. Screams erupted the instant the lights went out. The men and women pushed and shoved, falling and fleeing. Lan Jingyi shouted, "Stay where you are! Don't run! We'll arrest whoever runs!" These were not words spoken without reason. Wreaking havoc in the dark and taking advantage of confusion was the nature of evil spirits. The more the people screamed and ran amok, the easier it would be to attract trouble unknowingly. It was extremely dangerous to be left alone or to lose one's head at a time like this. And yet, it could not be helped that everyone was scared out of their wits, so how could they possibly pay attention to and heed these warnings? It didn't take long before the East Hall fell quiet, with only the sound of light breaths and faint sniffling. Most had probably left. In the darkness, a firelight suddenly flared. It was Lan Sijie, who had lit an illumination talisman. The flames of the illumination talisman could not be extinguished by the sinister wind that carried evil, and he used this talisman to relight the candles anew while the rest of the youths went around to console the others. Under the light, Wei Wuxian took a nonchalant glance at his wrists. Another cut had been healed. It was then that he suddenly realized that the number of cuts was wrong. There had been 2 cuts on his left wrist and 2 on his right. One cut healed after Mo Ziyuan's death, another cut healed after the death of Mo Ziyuan's father, and then a third after the death of the servant Atong. Tallying that up, there should have been 3 healed cuts, leaving only the cut with the deepest wound and the deepest hatred. But now there was nothing on his wrists. Not a single cut was left. Wei Wuxian trusted that Madame Mo was most definitely among those whom Mo Xuanyu wished to seek revenge upon. The longest and the deepest gash was likely for her, and yet it had surprisingly vanished. Was it Mo Xuanyu who had suddenly let it go and abandoned his hatred? That was impossible. His soul had been sacrificed as the price for summoning Wei Wuxian. In order for the cut to heal, Madame Mo had to die. Unless... He slowly moved his gaze from his wrist to Madame Mo, who had recently roused and was surrounded by the crowd. Her face was white as a sheet. Unless she was already dead. Wei Wuxian was sure that something had already possessed Madame Mo. If that thing was not a spirit, then what could it be? Suddenly, Ah Ding cried, Hand! Atong's left arm! Lan Sijie moved the illumination talisman over Atong's corpse. Sure enough, his left arm had also vanished. The left arm! In that flash of a second, everything was clear. The creature causing mischief and the vanishing left arms formed a connection that clicked in Wei Wuxian's mind. He suddenly snorted and burst out laughing. Lan Jingyi huffed. That dummy! How can he laugh at a time like this? But then he realized that, given that the man was a dummy, what was the point of bothering with him in the first place? However, Wei Wuxian grabbed Lan Jingyi's sleeve and shook his head. No! Lan Jingyi irritably tried to pull his sleeve back. No what? Not a dummy? Stop playing around. No one's got time for you. Wei Wuxian pointed at Father Mo's and Atong's corpses on the ground. That's not them. Lan Sijie stopped Lan Jingyi, who was about to blow up. He asked, You said that's not them. What do you mean? Wei Wuxian replied solemnly, That isn't Mo Ziyuan's dad, and that's not Atong either. With his face smeared in makeup, the more solemn he was, the more it felt like he really was mentally ill. However, under the haunting candlelight, his words were surprisingly hair-raising. Lan Sijie was stunned for a moment, and then questioned in spite of himself, Why is that? Wei Wuxian said smugly, Because of the hand. They're not left-handed. They always beat me with their right hands. I know that much at least. Lan Jingyi lost his patience and spat, What are you so smug for? Look at that pleased face. Lan Sijie, however, had broken out in a cold sweat from the shock. Thinking back, Atong had strangled himself using his left hand, and when Madame Mo's husband pushed his wife down, he had also used his left hand. But during the day, when Mo Xuanyu had been causing a ruckus in the East Hall, those two had been busy trying to chase him out using their habitual right hands. Surely they couldn't have both turned into left-handers all of a sudden right before their deaths. Although the cause was presently unknown, in order to investigate what was causing mischief, they had to start with those left arms. Having come to this conclusion, Lan Sijie sent a bewildered look at Wei Wuxian. Despite himself, he thought, For him to suddenly say something like that really doesn't seem like a coincidence. Wei Wuxian only continued to laugh cheekily, knowing that the hint had been way too conspicuous, but there was no other way. Thankfully, Lan Sijie didn't dig into it, thinking, Either way, since this Mo Gongzi was willing to call attention to it for me, it most likely wasn't done out of ill intent. He moved his gaze from Wei Wuxian, swept it over Ah Ding, who had fainted from weeping, and landed his eyes on Madame Mo. His eyes traveled down from her face to her hands. Her arms were hanging by her sides, mostly hidden in the sleeves, revealing only the tips of her fingers. The fingers of her right hand were snow-white and slim, truly the hand of a woman who lived in privilege and without the hardship of labor. However, the fingers of her left hand were longer and thicker than those of the right. The knuckles were curled and filled with strength. How was that the hand of a woman? It was clearly the hand of a man. "Hold her down," Lan Suzhui shouted. Those youths had already twisted Madame Mo's arm back in a hold. With a "forgive me," Lan Suzhui pulled out a talisman. He was ready to slap it down when Madame Mo's left arm twisted at an impossible angle, aiming for his throat. The only way for a living human to twist their arm that way would be if their bones were broken. The hand's movement was fast, and it would have seized his neck had it not been for Lan Jingyi tackling Lan Suzhui with a loud "Ga!" and blocking the attack for him. There was a flash of firelight. That hand had only just grabbed Lan Jingyi's shoulder when green flames flared to life at the same spot, and it instantly loosened its grip. Having just escaped death, Lan Suzhui was just about to thank Lan Jingyi for coming to his rescue when he saw that half of Lan Jingyi's uniform had been burned to ashes, making him look incredibly unkempt. Flustered and enraged, Lan Jingyi stripped off the unburnt half of his uniform as he looked back and yelled, "Why did you kick me? Stupid lunatic, do you want me killed?" Wei Wuxian scurried away, hugging his head. "It wasn't me!" It was most certainly he who had kicked Lan Jingyi. The outer robe of the Lan family's uniform was tightly embroidered with spells and incantations inside its lining to provide protection. However, the effect would have been nullified after only one use when encountering a formidable creature such as this. Under these dire circumstances, Wei Wuxian could only give Lan Jingyi a kick to make him use his body to shield Lan Suzhui's neck. Lan Jingyi was going to yell some more, but Madame Mo collapsed to the ground. The flesh and blood of her face had been drained so utterly that only a layer of skin pressed against her skull remained. The man's arm that did not belong to her fell off of her left shoulder, and yet its fingers could still move as it willed. It was as if it were a stretching, the pulsing of its veins clearly visible. That thing was the evil that had been summoned by the spirit attraction flag. Dismemberment was a standard violent death. It was a little more dignified than the way that Wei Wuxian had died, though not by much. Unlike being crushed to ashes, the limbs of a dismembered corpse retained a part of the grudges of the deceased. One would yearn to return to its body, yearn to die a complete corpse. Thus, it would also attempt to seek out the other parts of its body. Once found, the corpse would then perhaps rest in peace and satisfaction, or perhaps wreak greater havoc. If the rest of its original body wasn't found, however, a limb could only go for the second best option. What was the second best option? Seek out the bodies of living humans and make do, just as this left arm had demonstrated. Devour the left arm of the living, take its place, and suck out the living human spirit, blood, and flesh. Then abandon the body to continue searching for the next host. This would continue until all parts of its original corpse were found. Once this arm attached itself to a body, it was instant death for the host, though prior to their blood and flesh being completely eaten, the human could still move normally under the arm's control, as if it were still alive. After the arm had been summoned, the first vessel it found was Mo Ziyuan. The second vessel was Mo Ziyuan's father. When Madame Mo had told her husband to get lost, he'd acted out of character and pushed her. At first, Wei Wuxian had thought it was because the man was clearly heartbroken because of his son's death, and that he had also had enough of his wife's unreasonable behavior. But in retrospect, that had not been the demeanor of a father who had just lost his son. That had not been the stupor of despair. It had been stillness, the stillness of the dead. The third vessel was Ah Tong, and the fourth was Madame Mo. The left arm took advantage of the chaos when the lights went out earlier to migrate to her body, and when Madame Mo was killed, the last cut on Wei Wuxian's wrist had also vanished with her demise. Seeing how talismans were useless, but their clothes were not, all the Lan youths stripped off their outer robes and threw them at the left arm, covering and wrapping it in layers upon layers of robes like a thick white cocoon. A moment later, this ball of white clothes ignited with a whoosh, and the green flames blazing to the skies. Though it worked for the time being, it would not last long. Once the uniforms were completely burnt, that arm would break free from their ashes. While no one was paying attention, Wei Wuxian ran straight for the west courtyard. Over a dozen walking corpses those youths had captured were standing silently in the yard. A spell had been drawn upon the ground to seal them inside its boundary, and Wei Wuxian stomped on one of its characters, destroying the entire array. After 2 claps, the walking corpses jerked. Their white eyes opened abruptly, as if they had been shocked awake by an explosion of thunder. "Wake up," Wei Wuxian said. "It's time to get to work." He never needed any complicated spells or summoning incantations to summon corpse puppets. The most straightforward command would usually suffice. The walking corpses at the very front quivered as they struggled to shuffle a few steps forward. Then, the moment they approached Wei Wuxian, they fell face first to the ground like living humans, as if their legs had grown weak from terror. Not knowing whether to laugh or cry at this, Wei Wuxian clapped twice more, but much softer this time. However, these walking corpses had probably been born at the Mo estate and died here as well. They had never seen the world. So, while they instinctively obeyed the summoner's command, they were also terrified of the summoner for some reason, lying on the ground and whimpering, too afraid to get up. The crueler the evil spirit, the easier it was for Wei Wuxian to manipulate it. These walking corpses had never gone through his training, so they could not withstand his direct control. He had no materials at his disposal to immediately create a device that would ease their fears either, and nothing with which to improvise. As he watched the blazing green flames from the east courtyard gradually die down, an idea suddenly came to mind. Why go out searching to find a cruel and vicious deceased, one steeped in extreme hatred? The East Hall already had one, more than one. He darted back to the east courtyard. Lan Sijui's first plan had come to an end, and so he devised another. The youths all unsheathed their long swords, planting them in the ground to form a fence of blades. The ghost arms smashed about within the enclosure. It was taking all their energy just to hold the hilts in place and prevent them from being expelled by the force. No one had the time to pay attention to who was going in and out of the hall. Wei Wuxian stepped into the East Hall and yanked up the corpses of Madame Mo and Mo Ziyuan, one in each hand. In a low voice, he gave a command. "Awake yet?" At the sound of his voice, the souls returned. An instant later, Madame Mo and Mo Ziyuan opened their white eyes and let out a shrill shriek unique to malicious ghosts at the moment of their resurrection. Amidst the high and low shrieks, another corpse crawled to its feet in trepidation, calling out feebly with a voice that could not have been any softer. It was Madame Mo's husband. The cries were loud enough, and the hatred plentiful. Wei Wuxian was extremely pleased. "Recognize that arm out there?" He smiled. "Tear it apart." The 3 members of the Mo family were like 3 blasts of black wind, blowing forth in an instant. That left arm had broken a longsword. Just as it was about to break out of its pen, 3 left-armless fierce corpses came lunging at it. Even aside from the fear of disobeying Wei Wuxian's command, these 3 carried an intense hatred for the creature that had killed them, and they unleashed all their fury upon that ghost arm. The one leading the attack was undoubtedly Madame Mo. Once reanimated, female corpses were often particularly ferocious. Her hair was flying wild, her white eyes crawling with red, and her nails had burst in length exponentially. She was foaming at the mouth, her shrill cries practically raising the roofs, completely crazed. Mo Ziyuan followed his mother closely, working in concert with her to both tear and bite at the left arm, while his father trailed behind them, filling in the gaps between the other 2's attacks. The Lan youths who had been struggling to hang on earlier were all stunned. They had only ever heard of such fights between fierce corpses from sundry books and hearsay. This was the first time they had witnessed such a gory scene, and they gawked, unable to avert their eyes. They only had one thought in their minds. This is so exciting! The 3 corpses and the 1 arm were all in the throes of battle, when, suddenly, Mo Ziyuan shrieked as he dodged. That arm had swiped at his abdomen, and several ropes of his intestines drooped from the tear. Madame Mo snarled incessantly at the sight of this. She pulled her son behind her to shield him while escalating her attacks, her nails slicing through the air as sharply as blades of iron and steel. However, Wei Wuxian could tell she was slowly losing against the arm. Even 3 freshly dead fierce corpses working together could not subdue this 1 arm. Wei Wuxian watched the battle closely. He curled his tongue slightly, holding a sharp whistle back between his lips as he hesitated to let it loose. If he whistled, he could evoke greater hatred within the controlled fierce corpses, and that would perhaps turn the tables. However, it would be difficult to ensure that no one noticed he was the instigator. In the span of a second, that hand moved as fast as lightning, ruthless and precise as it snapped Madame Mo's neck. Seeing how the Mo family was being steadily beaten back, Wei Wuxian was just about to let loose the whistle he held under his tongue when, right then, 2 strums from a guqin sounded in the far distance. Those 2 notes were skillfully played, ethereal and clear, carrying with them the tinkling bleakness of windswept pines. The collection of demonic evils that were in the middle of the brawl all froze. The youths of the Lan clan of Gusu immediately beamed as if they had been resurrected. Lan Sijie raised a hand to wipe away the blood on his face and then looked up, calling out in delight, "Han Guangjun!" The moment he heard the cry of that sobriquet and the distant guqin, Wei Wuxian turned to leave. Another strum. This time the note was higher pitched, piercing through the sky like the austere harshness of winter's first approach. The 3 fierce corpses shrank back while covering one ear with their right hands at the same time. However, it was impossible to block out the eradication tone of the Lan clan of Gusu in such a way. They only managed to back up a few steps before there was the faint cracking sound from their skulls. As for that left arm, after engaging in such a ferocious fight, hearing the sound of the strings now made it suddenly drop to the ground. Although its fingers still twitched, the arm was already lying limp and silent. After a short silence, the group of youths couldn't help but erupt into loud cheers, the sound filled with the jubilation of having survived. They had endured a terrifying night, and now that there was help from the clan, they couldn't have cared less if they were harshly punished later for disgracing the sect with a breach of etiquette. While they waved towards the moon, Lan Sijie suddenly noticed that someone was missing. He tugged at Lan Jingyi. "Where is he?" Lan Jingyi was too busy being happy and replied, "Who? He who?" "That Mo Gongzi," Lan Sijie replied. "Huh? Why are you looking for that lunatic? Who knows, maybe he was scared of getting beaten up by me and ran off somewhere." ... Lan Sijie knew that Lan Jingyi was unmindful and straightforward, never thinking deeply on things or harboring suspicion. He thought to himself, "I'll just wait until Han Guangjun is down here, and then report to him about that man and the incident." The Mo estate slumbered soundly, though whether that piece was real or fake was difficult to tell. Even though there had been a bloody corpse fight in the Mo Manor's east and west courtyards, no one was getting up in the middle of the night to watch it. One had to pick and choose the right spectacle to watch, and a spectacle with such incessant screaming was best avoided. Wei Wuxian rapidly destroyed any remaining evidence of the sacrificial ritual array, and then ran out the door. Of all people who could have come, it had to be the Lan family. Of all people to come, it just had to be Lan Wangji. This was someone with whom he had once crossed paths and fought, so he retreated in a hurry. Anxious to find a steed, as he passed by a courtyard, he noticed a spotted donkey tied next to a large millstone, chewing something in its mouth. It seemed a little surprised when it saw him come dashing over, giving him a side-eye like a person would. The instant Wei Wuxian met its eyes, he was immediately moved by the disdain in its gaze. He went up to it, yanked off its rope, and started dragging it out. The spotted donkey loudly complained. Wei Wuxian cajoled as he dragged, coaxing it in every way possible to move it along. Stepping out into the lightening of dawn, they clattered onto the main road.